All right, let's begin. I hope everybody had a nice spring break. Wasn't very long though, right? As expected, I spent my spring break cutting trees, and at least it was a nice day to be outside. So I hope that you were able to do something similarly satisfying, maybe working on schoolwork and catching up. You know, that sometimes can be a relief just to get a bunch of work done. Looks like Aaron had a rough spring break. Sorry to hear that. Hope you're doing better now. All right, so let's go through. Oh, that's not the right date. This is not October 19th. There's certain times where I forget to update. There we go. That's more like it. March 22nd, class 24. All right, so I've just loaded a new homework assignment onto Blackboard, and you've got a week to complete it. Now, sometimes in the course evaluations, you know, at the end of the semester when you write a review of the class, sometimes the students say, this class was too much work. It's more work than any of my other 3 credit hour classes. But I mean, that might make sense if the other classes you're taking this semester are like, you know, a communications class and a sociology class. And, you know, if you're taking classes that aren't STEM related, then it might make sense that this is the most challenging class. So the main point I want to make is the reason why I push you is because I want you to learn and because I care about you and your preparation for the career that you're entering. And I don't want the reason that you're unprepared at some date in the future to be that I went too easy on you. I want you to be over-prepared rather than under-prepared if you find yourself in a position where you have to deal with money later on in life. And I'm glad to hear that this isn't the most difficult class. That suggests that dynamics is a lot of work. So I'm sure some of you at this point in the semester are feeling overwhelmed. And I certainly sympathize because I never had a semester where I felt like things were going smooth. I was always just scrambling and barely keeping my head above water. So I've been there. But I wanted to give you a little bit of context. The 10,000-foot view is you have to exert effort in order to grow. And in order to become stronger, you have to struggle. And so I intentionally give you some work because you can't learn this stuff unless you're solving problems. And so I'm here to help if you have questions, and specific questions are the easiest way for me to help you. If you ask a question like, my question is, I don't get it, you know, that's not much for me to push back about. But if you ask a specific question about a specific problem you're working on, then I'll work with you all day long until you figure it out. All right, so homework 9 is due on Monday next week, and the project, get an early start on that, because we've just now got a month of time remaining. Today we're going to change gears quite a lot. So far in this semester, in the first 2/3 of the class approximately, we were focusing on ways to assess the profitability of for-profit enterprises. And so whether it was external rate of return, or whether it was internal rate of return, or future worth analysis, or present worth analysis, all of that decision making was about how do you find the most profitable opportunity and how do you maximize earnings. And that's great. You know, money is important and it's a tremendous incentive for people to be efficient. If you don't have money, then you realize how much you need it to provide for the necessities of life and to help you solve the problems that you have, whether they're problems related to hunger or shelter or transportation. You've got to have money. And so it's important, but it's not the only thing that matters. Other things matter too, in addition to maximizing profit. And sometimes it makes sense to undertake projects or to make decisions that don't maximize profit. So what we're going to talk about in this next phase of the course are what are some tools we can use to analyze opportunities where maximizing profit isn't the only objective. Now let's talk about some of those opportunities. Here's some pictures of UN relief cargo aircraft and big bags of food that's going to be distributed to people who are experiencing a famine. And the people who eat that food, they're not going to pay for it. And we wouldn't have any way to analyze the profitability of something like that, because you have to buy the plane and you have to buy the food and the fuel. And so if we think about what's the external rate of return or what's the internal rate of return, it's just kind of like a does not compute type situation. It doesn't make sense. And so, if you were just trying to maximize profit, you certainly wouldn't give food to starving people. And if you're trying to maximize profit, would it make sense to install guardrails alongside a highway? Because think about the expense associated with highway safety. It looks like in this case they put in a hard curb on the median, and there's this steel guardrail, which presumably is very costly, both in material costs and planning and installation. It's a lot of expense. And so it might have been cheaper just to pave this road, but safety is another priority. This first picture of the famine relief, maybe that means that one of our priorities is maintaining a sense of humanity. Having sympathy for the difficulties of others. That's more important sometimes than maximizing profit. The second picture shows us that sometimes safety and protecting human life from accidents is more important and more valuable than maximizing profit. Here is an interesting photo. Anybody have a guess of what we're looking at? I'm not talking about the guardrail. I'm talking about this structure next to the guardrail. Any guess on what that's for? It's not a runoff barrier, although that's a fine guess. It's a sound barrier. Yeah, it's because, look at these trucks. There's a lot of highway noise that's generated, and whatever is on the other side of that barrier is now going to be a much more pleasant place to live than if that barrier wasn't there. So whether it's a wildlife preserve or a residential area, or it could be a park, there's just noise is pollution, and avoiding that noise pollution is worth spending money. So something was better than maximizing profit, and quality of life was the compromise that was made, and spending a little extra put in that noise barrier. Likewise, here is a picture that kind of illustrates the problem of pollution. And so there's garbage and a lot of polluted water in this waterway, and people are exposed to that pollution, and it causes a reduction in the quality of life. And so a lot of times we'll spend a little extra to make sure that garbage is put into a landfill. I pay, I think, about $22 a month to have my garbage taken away, and it's buried in a secure way where they pack clay layers on top of it so that the moisture in that garbage doesn't seep down and contaminate the groundwater. And even below the clay layers is a synthetic plastic liner, and so an engineered landfill avoids the problem of garbage getting into rivers. And so the Ohio River doesn't look like this because we don't all throw our trash into the tributaries. We pay a little extra. So all of these things, you're paying money that wouldn't necessarily be dictated if all you were trying to do is maximize profit. So it's not always about the money. And that was made plain when COVID started to get serious about a year ago, and people started thinking about protection of public health and making economic compromises to ensure that the disease spread less slowly than it otherwise would have. And I'm certainly not saying that everybody did things right. I think there are probably places where they curtailed economic activity too severely. But it's clear that we had to do something. We couldn't go about business as usual with absolutely no change. Otherwise, even more people would have died than did. So what our textbook says is that public sector projects are that category of activities where we may not be making money. These are cost-only alternatives, using the language of earlier in the semester. And so a public sector project is owned by either the people directly or owned by agencies that are subsidiaries of maybe the municipal or state government. And so here's just a list of projects that maybe wouldn't be undertaken for profit, but still need to be done in order to provide for the benefit of society. So just take, for example, a park, parks and recreation. Ritter Park here in Huntington is just gorgeous. It's one of the jewels of our area. But you don't have to pay to go there. And the city of Huntington pays money to keep it up. But it's just kind of for the collective benefit of everyone that it's there. And so here's an extended list of things that we do that the private sector maybe wouldn't be able to initiate a project like this for a variety of reasons. Sometimes they may operate after the project is completed. So for instance, an airport. It's pretty common throughout the world for airports to be managed by either a nonprofit or sometimes a for-profit entity, but it's much less common for an airport to be planned and built and executed just on a complete for-profit basis. There's usually some sort of government involvement. We're going to talk about the reasons why sometimes it takes government involvement to get projects like these undertaken. The purpose of these is sometimes they can generate revenue, but there's a difference between revenue and profit. And going back to the idea of an airport, when you use an airport, you have to pay a fee to go through there. It's built into the price of your ticket. And if you get an itemized breakdown of where the money goes with your ticket, you'll see how much goes to the airline, how much is for a fuel surcharge, how much of it goes to TSA, and how much goes to the airport authority. And so they're collecting revenue for people going through their airport, but that revenue is supposed to cover the costs and not necessarily generate profits that then enrich some shareholders someplace. Now, this table is really important, and it's important that you're able to explain, like a compare and contrast kind of a way. Like if you were ever in a situation, hint, hint, where I asked you to provide a short answer to a question, like compare this and that. So we'll go through some of these characteristics, but the greater details are available in your textbook that contrast public projects, which are owned by collectively all of us, and private projects that are initiated and owned by for-profit companies. So for instance, the reason why many of these things are done by the public sector rather than the private sector is because it requires a lot of money up front. And so there may only be a handful of companies that are able to raise enough money in order to do something large like build a dam. But governments, because they have the authority to tax and the ability to sell bonds, they're able to acquire large amounts of capital to undertake these big projects. Whereas there are only a few companies in the world that take on really large projects. And one that comes to mind would be like ExxonMobil. They have enormous projects that last a long time, but that's kind of the exception rather than the rule. And time span is another characteristic that contrasts what is publicly owned versus a private project. And so most companies are looking at a shorter term, and it may just be like a quarterly project, so it may be even less than a year. But what this table is saying is 2 to 25 years would maybe be the time that a private project is looking at. But a project that is initiated by the public sector can afford to be on the longer term, where a big piece of infrastructure like a dam or a bridge, it's going to be around for a long time. And so if it is a toll bridge, for example, like the Golden Gate Bridge, you have to pay to drive over that bridge. All of the revenue that's going to be coming in for that bridge is so far in the future that it's discounted really heavily. And so now remember, future revenue doesn't make much sense today. It's not worth much today. So if you're just a private company, then you'd maybe look at this thing that's going to last for a really long time and question whether it makes sense for you to build it, because it's going to be so hard to recoup your initial investment because so much of the revenue is far in the future. When a project is undertaken in the public sector, they get the funding through taxes and fees and bonds, and the private sector gets their financing through loans and stocks in addition to bonds. Because municipalities are less likely to default on bonds than a private company might, and because public sector projects, like the government that is underwriting a public sector project, they have the ability to tax. And so that is a really pretty powerful revenue stream. If you have the legal right to tax anything that's going on in your borders, then you're not going to lose your revenue like a company that could go out of business. And so that's why interest rates are lower for public sector projects, is because it's a really secure thing. It's a sure bet that they're always going to have revenue available. Whereas a private company may have a competitor pop up, or they may have some natural disaster that disproportionately affects their operations. And so it costs them more to borrow money compared to public sector projects. And that's part of why a public sector project can afford to be longer term, is because if they're borrowing money at a lower interest rate, then it's not so bad that the revenue is many years in the future. Imagine McDonald's building McBridge. Yeah. Now, selection criteria here, excuse me, multiple criteria just means that you have other considerations besides maximizing profit. The way that you choose which alternative in a privately financed project is just whatever maximizes your profits and whatever gives you a good rate of return. So it's economic is the environment of evaluation, but multiple criteria means that you may be choosing from among alternatives, and it could be that one alternative causes less disruption to the public's life, or it could be that one alternative is more visually appealing, or it's going to be less noisy. And so like all of those kind of, they're not touchy-feely criteria necessarily, but it's certainly a more diverse set of constraints than just maximizing the profits. And one last note down here at the bottom is I acknowledge that, if a public sector project is going to be undertaken, then they have to tax people to spend that money. Even if they're just selling a bond, eventually that bond has to be repaid. And if you do a project and take $1 for that project, you can't spend that same money on something else. And so even if it's just opportunity cost, the government has a responsibility to be judicious and to spend wisely. And so, it can be really infuriating when you see that there's waste and fraud and abuse. But of course, the solution to waste and fraud and abuse is just to fix those problems. It's not just to not do public sector projects, because I think we'll all be able to find examples of situations that the government can either is the only organization that can do something, or it's the most effective organization to initiate a project. And so there are certain things that we have to rely on the government to do. And so rather than trying to destroy the government's ability to do certain things, we should just try and make it as efficient as possible. All right. Nobody likes sitting in traffic. And fortunately, around here, we don't have to do too much of it. The exception being that Interstate 64 seems to get shut down a lot more than I would have expected before I lived here. I've never lived someplace where the freeway got closed down as often as I-64 seems to. But fortunately, there's lots of other routes. You can always go on US 60, or there's some side roads along the river and so on. But let's just use this as an example. Sitting in traffic, or being sick, or spending a day standing in a river fishing, or the noise and dust and visual dissatisfaction of looking at a construction site. One of the tricky things about the analysis method we're going to learn today is that you have to take things like sitting in traffic or spending a day fishing. You have to take these non-economic activities and assign a dollar equivalent to that. And so what I mean is, what you have to do for benefit cost analysis is you have to assign a cost to the delay that you experience when you're sitting in a traffic jam. So in other words, like, what's your time worth? Would you pay $8 an hour to get out of sitting in traffic? Would you pay $20 an hour to get out of sitting in traffic? If you were in a traffic jam and you knew that you could either sit there for an hour or pay $1,000, I'd sit there for an hour rather than pay $1,000. And so there is a job of trying to figure out on average, I think economists do this, they figure out on average what is the cost of certain activities, like a day of missing work for the average American, or what is the value, the economic equivalent value of recreation activities, or avoiding construction noise. And so I bring this up at the outset just to acknowledge something, and that is the benefit cost analysis we're doing at its foundation is a little bit squishy. There's some uncertainty there because what we're doing is we're translating a non-economic activity into a dollar equivalent. And so you can always argue that whether it's the benefits or the costs, that unless it's an actual cost or a revenue benefit, but some of these things that go into the equation are just translated to dollars, but they didn't actually begin as dollars. And so there can be something lost in translation where you're trying to convert that non-economic activity into dollars. All right, so B to C, benefit to cost, is what we're talking about today. And some of the rules when we apply the benefit cost formula, which I'll show you in a minute, is that anything that happens with a project, whether it is like traffic being impacted, like if you're having to do a detour, then that would be an impact of a project. You have to monetize the effect of that detour. Or if building a bridge is going to save people time, like take the 29th Street Bridge here in Huntington, that really cool looking one. You know, in the past they would have to drive downtown Huntington and then cross the bridge. But when they built the 29th Street Bridge, a lot of people were able to cross the river with less travel time. So you're trying to monetize that benefit. You're trying to say, how much is it worth on a per person basis, and then how many people go through that bridge in a year. And so everything related to a project is monetized. And we classify all of those effects as a benefit, a cost, or a disbenefit. A cost is usually thought of as an actual expense, whereas a disbenefit is just a bad thing that happens from the project. And you'll get a sense for that as we go through a couple of examples. So, for instance, the benefits are the advantages to the public. So a benefit isn't like the contractor's earnings, who gets paid to do the thing. So, you know, if you're building a bridge, in this list of variables, you wouldn't be accounting for like the profit that went to the contractor, because the benefits are the things that the outcome of the project. The disadvantages to the public, like delay, environmental damage, decreased value of assets, all of these disadvantages are the disbenefits, but then the costs are the actual dollar expenditures. And they can include both the initial costs, but then the annual operating and maintenance costs as well. Now, for us to put all of this into the ratio formula, benefit cost, we have to put the money in the same time. So for example, these annual maintenance and operation costs, think in your mind, visualize a cash flow diagram. Annual costs need to be taken to the present before you can add it to the initial costs. You can't add together money in different years. You have to take it to the same time before you can combine money. So that's the first thing that you got to keep in mind. And then the formula itself is going to already be aware of the fact that costs are outflows. And so you don't need to put a negative sign in front of the costs, because the formula I'm going to show you in a moment already takes that into account. And then one last note here is that if the government has a reduction in money they used to spend, so savings, then that can be subtracted from the costs. All right, so here's the formula for the conventional benefit to cost ratio. So what you do is you have the benefits in the numerator, you subtract out the disbenefits, and then in the denominator you combine together the initial lump sum capital costs. C sub I is what you spend in order to build the thing, and then M&O is the annual operating and maintenance costs. But before you add them together, you'd have to find the present value of the operation and maintenance costs. And the criteria for accepting the project is if this ratio is greater than 1, then you should accept the project. So what that means is the benefits should outweigh the costs. Think about what that ratio greater than or equal to 1. It means for every dollar of cost, you get more than $1 of benefits. There's a modified B to C ratio that simply puts the annual maintenance and operation costs in the numerator. Now, profitability index looks at things from the perspective of what if a public agency is working with a private partner. So an example of that is the rec center. You know, the Marshall Rec is not operated by the university. It's operated by a company. Although it's on university property and university students go use it, it's operated by some company. And so the profitability index is a way of looking at a project from the standpoint of an organization that doesn't have to incur disbenefits. And the criteria there is that it should be greater than 1. All right. Now, let's take a look at today's in-class exercise. We're going to use this formula, get some practice, dust off your ability to solve things by hand. We've been spending so much time in Excel recently. Do you remember how to find the present worth of something? For example, I've given you the table here, the factor table. Here's the 4% factor table. So you're going to use this today because we're going to go through and we're going to think about this project. It's a highway. And so the highway is going to collaborate with a private firm to complete the project. And we know the study period is 20 years. And so whatever is happening after the project is built, we're going to look at the benefits and the disbenefits into the future 20 years. And we're using a 4% discount rate. And discount rate is just another way of saying interest rate. And it's discounting because that means any revenue in the future is going to be taken to the present, and every year that it moves, it's losing 4% of its value. When you move back through time, the amounts get smaller. When you move forward through time, the amounts get larger. All right, so I've just restated, that is, the conventional B2C formula, the modified B2C formula, and the profitability index. And so what I suggest you start with is read through this problem statement and sketch a cash flow diagram, because we're going to have some construction costs, we're going to have annual maintenance costs, there's revenue and benefits here, disbenefits. And so just to make sure that you understand not only how much money there is associated with this project, but also when is the money, sketch out the cash flow diagram, and then A through G, I just step you through what I'd like you to do. Calculate the present worth of the costs, calculate the present worth of maintenance and operation, benefits, disbenefits, and so on. So the 4% table again is down here at the bottom, and if you don't have that printed or you don't have a PDF of it, why don't you take a screenshot of this right now so that you've got it available. Now I'm going to put you into the breakout rooms so that you can chat amongst yourselves, check answers. Being in the breakout rooms, it can be useful because you can say, hey, well, now what did you get for the present worth of the initial costs? And just make sure everybody's on the same page, or if you have a question, you can ask your colleagues in the breakout room, and I'll be going between them just to address any questions if there are some. So give me just a moment to put you in those breakout rooms. And we'll have about 13 or 14 minutes before I'll pull you out of the breakout rooms and we'll go over the solution together. Okay, welcome back everybody. You've been in the breakout rooms, but now we're going to go over the solution. We're running out of time. We've only got about 3 minutes of class remaining, so I want to show you the solution for this one. Maybe are you a little rusty? I think that it's been a while since you had to do something with the cash flow diagram, discounting it with the factor table. So here's what I had in mind, for example, with the initial costs. We've got $4 million that's already at the present, and an annual series of 18 million. So there's 4 equal payments of $18 million. And so we do P/A for that. That's the factor that's going to be used. And then this 4 million that is in year 5 needs to be discounted as well. So we'll do a P/F to move that back in time. So you can see the applicable factor values that were taken off of the table. And what we get is that it's going to be $72.6 million for the initial costs. Okay, now for the maintenance and operation, it's $1 million a year for 20 years. And so find the present equivalent of an annual series where we've got $1 million every year. We're discounting at 4%. And so here's the factor out of the lookup table. And when you discount all that maintenance and operation costs to the present, it's an equivalent of about 13.6 million. Okay, now the benefits vary over time. During the first 10 years, it's 3 million a year, and then it's 5 million a year after that. So the way that we handle that is 3 million during the first 10 years. We'll just get taken to the present with P/A. But then when we do a P/A with that second block of funds, the 5 million a year, that takes it to year 10. So that would be a lump sum at year 10, and then we have to do a single individual P/F to discount the lump sum back to the present. And so now the benefits have an equivalent present value of 51.7 million, and then the disbenefits, you can see how I've discounted them. There was also staggered, where the majority of the disbenefits were up front during the construction phase of the project. And so we discount the 10 million, the 5 million, the 2 million, and get them all combined. And now we just need to substitute them into the factor equations. And so the conventional ratio is going to be 0.41. And this is where you should have a sinking feeling in your stomach that this project is not worth doing. So our decision criteria is that this project is not suitable because the B to C ratio is less than 1. It means for every dollar you spend, you're only getting 41 cents of benefit. That's not good enough. We need to do better. Even from the modified ratio, things look a little bit worse. You're only getting 30 cents of benefit for dollar of cost. And the profitability index is likewise not above 1. And so the conclusion is this project should not be undertaken. This is a bad project. Even when we take into account the fact that these benefits are, we're converting it from whatever it was, improved convenience or whatever, we're converting that into dollar costs. And this project would be a thumbs down. All right, we're out of time. It's 12:50. And so I need to turn you loose so you can go on to your next class. Remember, our announcements are that your homework is due on Monday of next week. Have an early look there. It's not too long. And then the project. You should be spending some time thinking about the project, doing research, writing. Get an early start. All right, take care, everybody. I'll see you on Wednesday. Yes, I will show the solution again.